Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. As you know, our topic is managing nuclear risks in a multipolar nuclear world, and our speaker is Dr. Robert Litwak. Many of you will be familiar with the Doomsday Clock. This is the famous clock created by the then new Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1948 as a way to focus public and political attention on the risks of nuclear war. The clock didn't exactly fall into disuse, but it stopped moving forward when the Cold War ended and the nuclear drawdown and cooperative security and cooperative threat reduction efforts were undertaken. But in recent years, it's again been inching its way back towards midnight. And this follows from a widespread perception, not just among atomic scientists, that nuclear risks are rising and have been doing so for a number of years. And of course, there's a debate about they're rising, relatively speaking, but on an absolute scale, have they significantly gone up? And how high are these risks? And our speaker today has spent a good chunk of his career thinking about the questions of nuclear risk and their connections to a changing security environment. And he's the author of a new book, which he'll introduce to you, that characterizes and assesses these nuclear risks and explores the requirements of successfully managing them. Dr. Robert Litwak is Senior Vice President and Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He's served on the staff of the National Security Council as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and as a visiting fellow at multiple institutions in the United States and overseas, including the Russian Academy of Sciences. Rob's a frequent visitor to the lab. He's not able to join us, of course, today in person, but he often comes to share his work. He was with us about 3 years ago to talk about a report that he had recently finished on dealing with a nuclear-armed North Korea. So it's a pleasure to welcome him back. He has a bachelor's from Haverford College and a PhD from the London School of Economics, where he and I first met back before I think there was electricity. Our ground rules for the day are that Rob's remarks will be on the record, and then in the Q&A portion will be off the record. If you wish to join the Q&A portion, please either send a chat function to quote all panelists or just to me, or raise your hand electronically and I'll bring you into the conversation. Without further ado, Rob, thanks so much for making the time to do this. Thank you for your intellectual leadership on this topic. We're grateful to hear from you today. Over to you. Rob, you're muted. You have to unmute.
Hang on one sec.
You're good.
I passed the one item IQ test. I mean, the main question of the current era is, can you hear me? And I'm reminded of a time when Henry Kissinger was speaking, and it was an in-person meeting, and the chairman said, "Can everyone hear me?" And Kissinger from the side said in his inimitable accent, "By definition, those who cannot hear you will not respond." So I'm glad to be audible. I'm even going to shoot for intelligible. It's a pleasure to virtually return to the Center for Global Security Research. I want to thank Brad, who we were in graduate school with together, and he's gone on to become one of the country's leading experts on nuclear issues, played a key role in developing the Obama administration's nuclear posture review. I also, in the vernacular, would like to give a shout out to my old friend and colleague, Zach Davis. Zach and I co-organized back in the 90s, moving forward, a series of meetings with the Wilson Center on nonproliferation issues. And I'd particularly like to pay tribute to the work he's done, which has really been important, on South Asian nuclear security, the track 1.5 and 2 meetings that he participated in and led to reduce nuclear risks in South Asia. And that's really been an important contribution. My new book is available for download on the Wilson Center's website. It is popularly priced at free. And a link to that will be put into the chat area by Katie Thomas. Let me give you an overview of its main themes and conclusions. And I'm cognizant that about half the people on this call are natural scientists, and this ain't the law of thermodynamics. I mean, reasonable people can disagree on these issues, and I'm going to lay out my analysis of it, and I'm sure it'll generate a lot of comments and questions. Last year, in a poll of America's top fears, a nuclear weapons attack ranked 29th. The recent worldwide threat assessments by the Director of National Intelligence have led with the threat of a cyber attack. Yet a nuclear event, like a pandemic or climate change, would be a global game changer. And the risks of that, as Brad alluded to in his introductory remarks, have risen to their highest level since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Consider recent events. With North Korea, Bob Woodward's book Rage reveals that during the 2017 crisis, the United States, according to President Trump, was much closer to war than publicly known. And that was amidst concern in the administration that the Kim regime could launch a nuclear-armed missile at the US homeland. In 2019 and 2020, two pairs of states possessing nuclear weapons confronted one another along their contested borders. In February 2019, India and Pakistan clashed in the disputed region of Kashmir in a military confrontation that escalated to reciprocal airstrikes. And then in May and June 2020, India and China exchanged deadly gunfire along their frontier in the Himalayas for the first time in 45 years. These incidents involving conventional military forces inherently carried the risk of escalation to the nuclear level. My study is a survey. It examines the heightened risk across the three major nuclear categories. The first is relations among current nuclear weapon states, or what policy analysts call vertical proliferation. Second, the possible proliferation of nuclear weapons to additional states, what is called horizontal proliferation. And third, nuclear terrorism. At the outset, I should stipulate that my study did not consider the elimination of nuclear weapons. That visionary objective is not remotely on the policy horizon. And the feasibility of it and the desirability of it is hotly debated in the analytical community and in the policy community. I would agree with the assessment of Brad Roberts, who wrote recently in the publication Daedalus, quote, "In an eroding security environment, the most likely gains in nuclear risk reduction will be in deterring threats rather than reducing or eliminating them," close quote. I think he's spot on. My study explores utilitarian options to deter and, if possible, ameliorate risks. And I'm not optimistic about the prospects, but I've laid it out analytically. I'm reminded of the great political scientist Alexander George in his gem of a book, Bridging the Gap, where he distinguished between the role of scholar or analyst and policymaker. And George, in the book, brilliantly lays out that the role of the policy analyst is to lay out the analytical options. And what are the practical possibilities? It's up to the policymakers, however, to render a political judgment about the feasibility of them or whether they can be implemented and embraced. So I'm laying out the analytical options, but I don't discount the political impediments to achieving them. For each of the three categories, I focus on a central dilemma. As the late Brent Scowcroft observed, problems have solutions, dilemmas have horns. These policy tensions can't be resolved, but if clearly understood, they can be better managed. So let me turn to the first category, relations among nuclear weapon states in a multipolar world, that first category of vertical proliferation. Current developments are recasting two risks of the bipolar Cold War era in an emergent multipolar context. The first risk is the relationship between nuclear deterrence and the propensity for conflict at lower levels on the continuum of military force. After both the United States and the Soviet Union acquired thermonuclear weapons, the British strategist E.H. Little Hart speculated, it was 1954, quote, to the extent that the H-bomb reduces the likelihood of full-scale war, it increases the possibility of limited war pursued by widespread local aggression, close quote. Policy analysts would later refer to this as the stability-instability paradox. That stability at the nuclear level could generate instability by empowering rival states to pursue tactical gains through non-nuclear means. Nuclear weapon states are currently engaged in strategic competition over the territorial status quo in areas of vital interest. Now, this contrasts to the Cold War period, where the superpowers engaged in competition in the regions of what we then called the Third World, Angola, Vietnam, etc. These were commitments which were clearly of peripheral magnitude, whereas the current areas where there's territorial competition, these are vital interests to the powers engaged. Now, these regional flashpoints span the globe, from East Asia to South Asia to Europe. Let me touch on the main ones that are familiar to you. Taiwan. The most likely pathway to war between the United States and China stems from the unresolved status of Taiwan. And there's a debate ongoing now over whether the United States should maintain its current policy, which has been described as strategic ambiguity, about how the United States would respond if China attacked Taiwan, or should the US security commitment to defend Taiwan be overt? The president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, recently made that argument, for example. The second flashpoint, the South China and East China Seas. The resource-rich South China Sea, through which over $3 trillion in trade transits annually, is a geostrategic zone of competition between the United States and China's neighbors. China has asserted expansive claims of sovereignty over islands and maritime zones, even going to the point of creating islands. To counter China's excessive maritime claims, the United States has conducted freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, in the South and East China Seas to demonstrate the United States, as they put it, will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. But the dangers are there. In October 2018, a Chinese warship came within 45 yards of the US Navy destroyer USS Decatur, which was transiting the South China Sea. Third flashpoint, the Sino-Indian border. And I've alluded to the June 2020 border skirmish in which Indian and Chinese military forces had their first lethal clash in over 4 decades. And this is the remote disputed Himalayan border region, but it's in an area, a geostrategic zone running through South Asia and East Asia, which is now being contested by the great powers. Fourth, Kashmir. The region has been the epicenter of conflict between India and Pakistan since they gained independence from Britain after partition in 1947. And there have been 2 wars over Kashmir, in 1965 and in 1999. And the nonproliferation scholar George Perkovich, in one of his writings, argued, and really speculated, that Pakistan in 1999 was emboldened to take actions because the year before it had demonstrated that it had a nuclear weapon capability. Fifth and finally, you have the former Soviet republics. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea in 2014 led to the imposition of economic sanctions and Russia's diplomatic isolation. It's also reset the debate over Vladimir Putin's revanchist intentions. This was the first a change in the territorial status quo in Europe through military force and set that precedent. And the Kremlin has asserted a right to protect ethnic Russians and Russian speakers beyond Russia's borders, which it says, which number some 25 million, and it's offered citizenship to millions of ethnic Russians living in the neighboring former Soviet republics. Recall, Russia doesn't have borders. Russia is where Russians are, and Russians spread out, particularly during the Soviet period, into the then republics of the Soviet Union. This expansive definition of security, Russia's assertion of its right to protect ethnic Russians, has important implications for these former Soviet republics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, which are NATO members and have the gold standard Article 5 commitment of NATO. These flashpoints are fueled by nationalism and expansive assertions of state sovereignty, as I've alluded to. Russia and China have their own version of America first. And India and Pakistan are both produced in kind of each in their unique context, are in a hyper nationalist phase. So it is possible that competition, and again, recall, this is competition. It's not in a peripheral area. These are geographical zones of vital interest to the nuclear weapon states. This competition could morph into conflict through inadvertent escalation driven by miscalculation and misperception. Now, for historians, this is the 1914 model. Great powers, the powers being sucked into a conflict through escalation in an area that it is in the case of the Balkans, it was peripheral area. These are vital interests to them. I mean, it's East and South China Sea, Kashmir, it's the former Soviet Union. These are not peripheral in that respect, and that means the stakes are even higher. But the risk on the 1914 model, I believe, is those conditions are present: inadvertent escalation through misperception and miscalculation. If that weren't enough, though, this risk is compounded by key developments affecting the deterrent relationships among nuclear weapon states. During the Cold War, the great RAND strategist Albert Wohlstetter questioned whether the balance of terror was, in fact, in his word, delicate, by which he meant that one side might see an advantage to go first, as it were, that they could achieve a disarming first strike. He was writing in the 50s when he pointed to the vulnerability of U.S. bombers to a Soviet ballistic missile attack. That dynamic, the delicate balance of terror, and where one side might perceive an incentive in going first in a crisis, that dynamic was evident in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev made a desperate bid to redress a strategic imbalance by deploying medium-range missiles to the island. Kennedy had debunked the missile gap that he ran on in the 1960 election. If anything, there was a gap in the U.S. favor, and it was that gap that Khrushchev was desperately trying to address through the deployment of these medium-range missiles to the island. In its aftermath, the shocking aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides developed survivable second strike capabilities that removed the incentive for preemptive action, but left both sides mutually vulnerable. The British strategist, Philip Windsor, who was the mentor to both Brad and me at the London School of Economics, he commented that the most important arms control development of the Cold War era was the creation of survivable second strike nuclear delivery systems. These capabilities made assured retaliation a certainty and removed the possibility of a disarming first strike. That nuclear stalemate, of course, was captured in the infelicitous acronym MAD. But as Robert Legvold, the great political scientist, observed, the United States and Russia have shown, as he put it, a long-standing uneasy reconciliation with mutual assured destruction. And that's particularly the case for the United States now with China's augmentation of its nuclear arsenal. The aversion to assured destruction has led to a focus on its alternative, which is damage limitation or war fighting. And there's a persisting tension between these two views of the role of nuclear weapons, assured retaliation versus damage limitation, or bluntly, war fighting. The question now is, are we recreating the risks of 1962? Are nuclear deterrent relationships, to use Wallstedter's word, becoming delicate? Is strategic stability eroding? In the Daedalus issue published by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, in which Brad had a wonderful essay, the editors, Chris Chaiba and Bob Legvold, provide analytical clarity to this concept of strategic stability. They unpack the term. And it's usually conflated to mean both crisis stability and arms control, arms race stability. They unpack it. Crisis stability means that even in a conventional war, or faced with a possible nuclear attack, states would not use nuclear weapons for fear such escalation could bring certain disaster. Crisis stability, they argue, must be robust, even against inadvertent or mistaken nuclear escalation. By contrast, arms race stability means that nuclear powers do not have incentives to pursue weapons or weapons deployments, resulting in action-reaction cycles that undermine crisis stability. So with that analytical framework, let's look at some key developments that are familiar to all of you. The first, of course, and it's the starting point of my analysis, is multipolarity, namely that nuclear dyads, in the familiar Cold War bipolar struggle, are being supplanted by triads. We now have US, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, China. Triads in which an action by one power affects the other two. Another key development, second one, essentially the end of arms control, virtually. And the possibility that it could usher in an era of unconstrained competition. And this challenge to arms race stability, referencing back to the Chaiba-Legvold definition, could affect crisis stability by increasing escalatory risks. So there's this linkage between arms control instability and stability and crisis stability. A third trend: all the nuclear weapon states are embarked on ambitious force modernization programs, and they're developing capabilities, and the familiar debate about low-yield nuclear weapons, which critics warn make them more usable in a crisis. This goes back to this policy tension between assured destruction and damage limitation and escalatory control. Under this rubric of force modernization, one has to note that China has long had a posture of minimum deterrence, but the question is raised whether its current modernization program is intended to maintain an assured retaliatory capability consistent with minimum deterrence, or is it intended to develop new warfighting capabilities, particularly at the theater level? The Trump administration has alerted us to the risk of an escalation in its nuclear posture review, where they claim that the Russians, and this is controversial, has adopted a quote-unquote escalate to de-escalate posture involving the first use of tactical nuclear weapons. A fourth trend, and I know the lab's been doing a lot of work on this, the risk of cross-domain escalation. Back in the Herman Kahn Cold War days, military escalation was traditionally conceived as progressing from conventional to nuclear. In a multipolar system, with the advent of nuclear technologies, escalation during a crisis may occur in a non-traditional domain, cyber or space. Conflict escalation could plausibly take the form of a cyber attack to interfere with an adversary's communications with its nuclear systems, or attack a reconnaissance satellites to blind an adversary. I want to footnote there a conversation I had with Zach Davis about this issue, which really helped clarify my thinking, such as it is. That if we think about how war with China might initiate, we think of conventional to nuclear. Well, they may come in with a chemical weapons attack to make our forces sick, coupled with some ASAT attack on capabilities plus a cyber attack. It could unfold in a different way. And the question is whether we think of these cross-domain issues as new rungs in an escalatory ladder, or are they essentially so unwieldy and unmanageable that once we embark on that kind of escalation, really the notion of controlling escalation really becomes illusory at that point. And I, as they say on the quiz show Jeopardy, I put a question mark at the end of that emphatically. So we are in a new strategic environment. What steps can ameliorate these risks to strategic stability, both crisis stability and an arms race stability? And I'm not sanguine that these things can be adopted, but I put them out there. First, there's resolving and managing regional flashpoints. I mean, the best way to avoid conflict is to ameliorate them. But if these cases were easy, we would have solved them a long time ago. I think the best we can plan for is some type of confidence building measures to make escalation less likely. And I'm thinking here of the cues, these code for unplanned encounters at sea, to which both this China and the United States are signatories. This may be a mechanism for managing maritime tensions between their navies in the absence of some type of territorial, codification of a territorial status quo that parties agree to. A second component in terms of measures that to address this situation is maintain the residual arms control architecture. It's really under pressure, it's eroding, but the debate now about New START and its extension, that would provide some basis for certainty. And of course, we have to address the issue of whether China's rising capabilities, but it would be a so to speak, a placeholder that would allow for diplomacy to take its course. A third measure that could ameliorate the risks are avoid the blurring of conventional and nuclear operations to prevent inadvertent escalation. In this context, there's a debate on whether conventional warheads on ballistic missiles, such as that envisioned under prompt global strike, has utility, which does to reach targets at distance quickly, but it runs the risk that Russia could perceive them and respond to the launch of a missile that it perceives as that delivery vehicle is associated with U.S. nuclear capabilities, which is a non-trivial risk. And then finally, there's managing complex linkages in a multipolar system, trying to get how do we manage these triads where action in one theater, one realm affects the others, like the U.S. decision to withdraw from the INF Treaty was framed in terms of what's going on in East Asia with Chinese deployments and developments in that strategic theater. And it pointed to this linkage between among the nuclear weapon states in a multipolar system. This tension can't be resolved easily. I think one way, and it's been proposed, and it's difficult, and it may not lead to much, but at least resumption of a strategic dialogue within the triads to talk about force modernization, to clarify intentions, try to reduce the risk of inadvertent escalation through miscalculation and misperception. That sounds like a weak menu. It's either weak or unachievable. But going back to what Alexander George said, analytically, these are the options we have, and it remains to be seen what can be accomplished. So to recap the categories of dilemma one, the relations among nuclear weapon states, my bumper sticker for that is 1914 meets 1962, namely that escalation from a regional flashpoint could occur in a context where strategic stability is under significant challenge, and temptations to act early in a crisis in the belief that escalation can be controlled, that temptation may arise. So it's a very dangerous combination of the 1914 risk and the 1962 risk. Let me turn to the second nuclear category, and I'm going to go through the next two categories more quickly. I wanted to spend the bulk of the time, given the rubric of my talk, on category one. The second category, nuclear category, is the possible proliferation of nuclear weapons to additional states, so-called horizontal proliferation. We don't live in John Kennedy's nightmare vision of a world of 35 nuclear weapon states that he laid out in 1962. It did not come to pass. The reasons for this have been explored in the literature. Zach Davis edited an excellent book that looked at nuclear intentions and why states have not chosen to go nuclear and why those who have gone nuclear. There are 9 states, the familiar 9, the P5, plus 3 states that exercised their sovereign right not to join up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty: India, Pakistan, Israel. Give them their due. They did not sign up to the treaty, and like North Korea and Iran, which did sign up to the treaty, they didn't cheat within the treaty. They exercised their sovereign right. So North Korea and Iran are treated differently because they signed up to the deal under NPT and then they cheated within it. But in addition, these are countries that, these are states that combine hostile capabilities, combine capabilities with hostile intent. North Korea and Iran are, so to speak, adversarial proliferators, states that we've referred to, the United States government has referred to. It's not a political science term, it's the US government, including the Trump administration, is referred to as rogue states. And the term rogue states, which I wrote about in a series of books, was a unilateral American political concept. And it invariably raised the question of what the US objective should be. Should it be behavior change or regime change? And the argument of the critics, those proponents of tough action against these states, argued that behavior change is not going to get you there because the threatening behavior is inextricably linked to the character of the regime. So if you want to turn off the dangerous threatening behavior, you need to change the regime. This was the argumentation that was laid out in the 90s when the rogue state concept was taken on board in the official US lexicon. And I'm not some fetishist for language, but it's rather the set of policies associated. Once you designate a country a rogue state, it really puts them beyond the pale of normal diplomacy. After 9/11, in that changed strategic environment, that argumentation that the threat derives from the character of the regime, that was central to the case for preventive war against Iraq. And then we're left with Iran and North Korea in the wake of Iraq. And we couldn't replicate the Iraq model in either North Korea and Iran for obvious reasons. We also weren't prepared at the time to offer the Libya deal, which I'm happy to discuss during the discussion period. And we were caught betwixt and between. The Obama administration sought to reboot policy by eschewing the term rogue state and all the baggage it had, and calling North Korea and Iran outlier states. And they went for, the Obama administration with Iran went for a transactional deal focused on the discrete nuclear issue. And that was the critique. The critique was, it was just transactional. It was not transformational. It didn't address all of the other areas of concern about Iran. So when the Trump administration came to office, in addition to reviving the term rogue state with the baggage that the term has, it withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, and Secretary Pompeo laid out 12 parameters that are comprehensive. And as one observer put it, would essentially require Iran to no longer be Iran. It would essentially require regime change in Iran, though the administration claimed that its objective was not regime change. The Trump administration's policy toward North Korea, which has an arsenal estimated 30 to 60 weapons in the open literature, has also been transformational in the sense that it's seeking CVID, comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible disarmament. And the CIA director, Gina Haspel, has said 0 weapons is not on the table as long as the Kim family rules in Pyongyang. That's not a quote, that's captures your sentiment. Namely that the North Korean regime views nuclear weapons as essential to its survival. They point to Gaddafi and Saddam, both who didn't have nuclear weapons, and they were overturned in US wars of regime change. It's also the one bargaining chip that North Korea can play again and again and again to shake down Japan, South Korea, the United States for the international community for aid. So right now, diplomacy is at an impasse, and Iran is beginning to push up against the constraints under the JCPOA. They haven't withdrawn, but it's really reaching a point of concern. With North Korea, the Bush-Kim summit meetings, in a sense, the impact was psychological more than practical. It normalized Kim. North Korea is no longer viewed as a crazy state, a rogue state, a crazy state. To be sure, it's not a normal state, but it's no longer viewed as being irrational, and where the possibility, therefore, of deterrence becomes an option. Early in the Trump administration, National Security Advisor McMaster said they're not, deterrence may not work with them, and underlying that was the view that this is an irrational state, in addition to being kind of crazy. The Kim summits normalized Kim in that respect. So where we're at now, in the study, I advocate for a pivot to transactional diplomacy with both states, not dismissing the hurdles. With Iran, it would be a JCPOA plus, where you would prioritize among the Pompeo parameters to try to extend deadlines, sunset clauses, address low-hanging fruit among the if I may use that metaphor, among the Pompeo parameters. And for North Korea, it would be a freeze, which a number of analysts, like Hecker at Los Alamos and Stanford now have addressed, which would freeze missile and nuclear testing and the production of weapons usable materials, essentially to make a bad situation from getting worse. North Korea has demonstrated long-range lift capability. The DIA says it's miniaturized, and it's an open source comment. But they haven't demonstrated reentry and guidance, which is a non-trivial, complex, set of integrated technologies that took the United States a long time to test. So they've not demonstrated that capability. I wouldn't make a bet that if they lobbed something towards us, that it wouldn't go off and hit some target between kind of Anchorage and Key West. But they've not demonstrated that capability, and that's why a freeze has some appeal. So to recap the dilemma of Category 2, it's a dilemma of transactional versus transformational strategies towards these countries of proliferation concern. Well, let me turn to the third category, nuclear terrorism. I'll go quickly through that. For terrorists, there are three pathways to the bomb. They can buy one, they can steal one, or they can build one. Each of these routes requires the involvement of a state, whether through the transfer as a deliberate act of state policy by a ruling regime, or through leakage, that is a failure to exercise sovereign control over weapons and weapons usable material on this territory. The state dimension of non-state nuclear terrorism is thus essential. Al-Qaeda does not have its own uranium enrichment program to produce weapons usable material. If you think of the countries of concern, Pakistan and Russia would be the concern there is leakage. With North Korea, there's concern, as one former Secretary of Defense put it, that North Korea would sell anything to anyone. There's a concern that they might sell it or transfer. But if a nuclear weapon were to be detonated in America, Europe, or elsewhere, what state would be the most likely source of the weapon? Interestingly, the one country that would not be on the list as a likely suspect would be Iran, which we have, the State Department have deemed the leading state sponsor of terrorism. And the reason for that is that under the JCPOA, its access to weapons usable material has been blocked for now. So in the discussion in the terrorism chapter, I basically lay out the two variants of deterrence: deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. Deterrence by denial gives us leverage on the possibility of leakage. Examples of deterrence by denial are the cooperative threat reduction program, which has ended, or the nuclear security summits that occurred under the Obama administration, locking down materials and making access much more difficult. But right now, there's a lack of focus and urgency. The NTI nonprofit organization has given Russia and Pakistan failing grades in having effective measures in place to prevent diversion. Deterrence by punishment or transfer would entail punitive consequences for transferring. And in this, I'll just sort of briefly allude to the importance of attribution capabilities, so that if a state did transfer it, they would know that they're running the risk that it could then be attributed back to them and would unleash a regime-changing response not only by the United States, but probably backed by the international community. If you have a state transferring nuclear capabilities to a non-state actor, and I'm distinguished here, Pakistan, transferring nuclear capabilities to Libya or North Korea. I'm talking about, to Al-Qaeda or to ISIS. If that were to occur, then in a sense, all bets are off with that regime. So that I think deterrence by punishment gives us leverage on the transfer possibility, and that points to the importance of the other route by which of terrorist acquisition leakage, which is probably the greater threat in terms of being the most viable pathway for terrorist acquisition. Again, that brings us back to the essential role of states, and that's my third. That's the third dilemma for category 3. State, and the bumper sticker it'll be a long bumper sticker. State-focused strategies to counter non-state threats. If you get it right on the state level, it doesn't eliminate the non-state threat, but it takes you quite a ways there. So that's my recap. Dilemma 1, 1914 meets 1962. Dilemma 2 for horizontal proliferation. Transactional versus transformational strategies. Dilemma 3 under terrorism, getting it right on the state level. State-based strategies to counter non-state threats. That doesn't eliminate them, but get you quite a ways there. So in conclusion, when Einstein was asked, and we have a number of natural scientists on this, real scientists on this call, as opposed to social scientists, no aspersions there, but natural scientists know their physics. When Einstein was asked how he could unravel the structure of the atom, but was unable to devise political means to prevent it from destroying humanity, he famously replied, because politics is more difficult than physics. The current nuclear risks are even more complex and dangerous because of the multiplicity of actors, emergent technologies, and the absence of an institutional framework to manage competition. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thanks, Rob. That was excellent. I appreciate the comprehensive view and the careful analytic structure and cogent summaries.